A clay pot filled with wet sand can keep vegetables fresh for 3 weeks without a single watt of electricity. 2 pots, some sand and water, straight from your own tap is all it takes to build one. No compressor, no motor, no gas, no monthly bill arriving through the letterbox. Just a piece of fired clay, sitting quietly in the shade, doing work that a modern refrigerator does with wires and coolant and noise. I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, in a stone farmhouse where the nearest electricity pole was over a mile away for most of my boyhood. My grandfather kept a small dairy herd and a kitchen garden that fed the whole household, and he had no patience for spending money on anything the old way could do just as well. He taught me how to keep milk from turning sour by midday, how to store carrots through the first frosts of autumn, and how to keep a slab of butter firm on a hot July afternoon, using nothing more than clay, water, and a bit of common sense passed down from his own father. These were not stories told to me for entertainment on a winter evening. They were the daily rhythm of the house, as ordinary as feeding the hens or drawing water from the well. If the pot by the dairy door was not damp to the touch, someone filled it before breakfast. If the vegetables inside had not been rotated in a week, someone rotated them without being asked twice. I watched this happen for years before I ever understood the reason behind it, and I am sharing it now because so few households remember any of it at all. By the time I was old enough to ask questions properly, my grandfather had already been keeping food this way for the better part of 5 decades, and he had never once needed a repairman, a spare part, or a call to any company to keep the system working exactly as it should. He would often remind me that his own grandmother had kept food cool the very same way. Long before he was ever born, using pots, she had shaped herself on a simple potter's wheel down in the village. Somewhere along the way, the humble clay pot got pushed quietly out of the English kitchen. Refrigeration became something you bought rather than something you built, something you plugged into the wall and paid a company to keep running every single day of the year, regardless of whether you actually used it. Once the electric fridge became standard in the 1950s and 60s, the old cooling pots were seen as something for people who could not afford better, a relic rather than a working method. The companies selling refrigerators and the utility companies selling the electricity to run them had no reason at all to remind anyone that a piece of fired clay and a bit of water could do a version of the same job for almost nothing. So the knowledge quietly slipped out of most homes, remembered only by a handful of old farming families in places like the Dales, and by aid workers overseas who never stopped relying on it because the power never reached them in the first place. Nobody sat down and decided to erase the method deliberately, and I am not suggesting anything so dramatic as a conspiracy. It was simply a case of one convenience quietly replacing another, and the older, cheaper way being left behind in the process without much thought given to it at all. What you are about to hear is not a theory dreamed up for a video. This method has been tested across scorching summers in places with no power grid at all by people who had no other option but to make it work properly. It worked for them season after season, and it still works today in a garden shed, a stone pantry, or a shaded corner of a yard, exactly as it always has. Let us begin with the first step, which is choosing the right pots for the job. You need 2 unglazed clay pots, one noticeably smaller than the other, so that the smaller one can sit inside the larger one with a clear gap running all the way round. Ordinary terracotta plant pots from a garden center will do the job perfectly well, provided they are unglazed, because a glaze seals the surface of the clay and stops water from passing through it at all. A common pairing is an outer pot roughly 25 centimeters across and an inner pot somewhere between 15 and 18 centimeters. Though the exact measurements matter far less than the gap between the two, which wants to sit at around 3 to 5 centimeters all the way round once the inner pot is centered properly. If either pot has an open drainage hole in the base, and most garden pots do, you will need to seal it before you begin. Using a plug of natural clay, plumber's putty, or even melted candle wax pressed firmly in and left to set hard. My grandfather used a plug of raw clay dug straight from the riverbank behind the farmhouse, pressed in with his thumb and smoothed flush with the bass, then left out in the sun for a full day before the pot was ever put to use. That is only the first part of pots building this properly, and the second part is where most people are genuinely surprised, because it has nothing at all to do with the pots themselves. The second step is understanding the principle that makes the whole system work in the first place, and that principle is evaporative cooling. Water, when it evaporates from liquid into vapor, pulls heat away from whatever surface it is leaving. And that is simply how the physics of evaporation behaves, whether we notice it or not. This is the same reason a person feels a sudden chill stepping out of a warm bath into a drafty room, and the same reason your skin cools rapidly once sweat begins to dry off it on a hot summer's afternoon. An unglazed clay pot is slightly porous, which means water can seep slowly and steadily through the walls of the clay itself, moving from the wet inside of the wall to the drier outside. When that water finally reaches the outer surface and evaporates away into the air, it draws heat out of the clay, and the clay in turn draws heat away from whatever is packed against its inner wall, whether that is vegetables, dairy, or anything else stored there. This is not a fast process, and it was never meant to be, because slow and steady is exactly what allows the system to hold a stable, cool temperature over days, rather than losing all its cooling within a single hour. Keep listening, because the third step is the one most people get wrong on their very first attempt. And getting it right is the difference between a pot that barely helps and one that keeps food properly fresh for weeks at a stretch. The third step concerns the sand that fills the gap between the two pots. You want ordinary builder's sand or a coarse river sand, washed if it happens to be dusty, and entirely free of stones, twigs, or clumps of hardened clay that would create uneven pockets. Fill the gap between the pots with this sand, packing it in evenly on all sides so there are no large air gaps left behind, because an air gap breaks the chain of moisture that the entire system depends on to function. Once the sand is fully packed in, soak it thoroughly with water, right up to the point where it can hold no more and a little begins to pool visibly at the surface. The sand acts as both a wick and a small reservoir at once, holding water firmly against the porous walls of both pots so that evaporation can happen continuously rather than only in short, uneven bursts throughout the day. In hot, dry climates, this sand needs topping up with fresh water once or even twice a day without fail, but in the milder, damper conditions of an English summer, once a day is usually plenty, and some households manage perfectly well with a top-up every other day instead. Now we come to the fourth step, which is placement, and this matters a good deal more than most people expect it to. The whole assembly must sit somewhere shaded, and ideally, somewhere with a gentle breeze passing over it, because moving air speeds up evaporation and noticeably improves the overall cooling effect. A north-facing windowsill, a covered porch, or a shaded spot beneath a lean-to roof near the back door were the traditional choices in farmhouses without electricity, because direct sunlight heats the pot faster than the evaporation can ever hope to cool it, undoing the entire purpose of the exercise. My grandfather kept his by the north wall of the dairy, tucked under the eaves, where direct sun never reached it, even at the height of midsummer. The fifth step concerns exactly what goes inside the inner pot, because not every food benefits equally from this particular kind of cooling. Root vegetables such as carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beetroot do wonderfully well, often lasting 3 weeks or longer, because their natural structure holds moisture well on its own. And they are not especially sensitive to small swings in temperature from one day to the next. Leafy greens do well too, though they benefit from being wrapped loosely in a damp cloth before going into the pot, which stops them wilting in the slightly drier pockets of air that tend to form nearer the rim. Soft fruits are more particular, and while apples and pears store reasonably well for a couple of weeks, delicate berries are better eaten fresh or preserved another way entirely. Since this method was never built for the very coldest end of food storage, dairy, such as butter and hard cheese, benefits enormously from this treatment. And this is, in fact, one of the oldest recorded uses of the method in English farmhouses, where butter that would otherwise turn rancid within a single day could instead be kept firm and sweet for the better part of a week. Keep listening, because the sixth step explains exactly why this method outperforms most people's first impressions of it, and it comes down to the actual temperatures involved. A well-built and properly maintained pot in pot cooler can bring the internal temperature down to somewhere between 8 and 15 degrees Celsius below the surrounding air temperature, depending on the local humidity and airflow on any given day. On a warm English day sitting around 22 degrees, that can mean an internal pot temperature comfortably between 8 and 14 degrees, which sits squarely within the range most household refrigerators are actually set to run at. This is not simply a claim passed down as folklore, because this exact method was documented and tested formally in hot, dry regions during the latter part of the last century, where it extended the shelf life of vegetables from a matter of days to several weeks with no power source of any kind involved. The physics behind it is centuries old, quietly at work long before anyone ever wrote a scientific paper describing it. And it was used in exactly the kind of stone farmhouses and cottages that still dot the Yorkshire countryside to this day. The seventh step concerns covering the pot properly, because leaving the top open undoes a good deal of the benefit you have already built into the system. A damp cloth laid loosely over the opening of the inner pot serves two purposes at once: keeping dust, flies, and other insects well away from the food, while also slowing the loss of moisture from the top surface, where evaporation would otherwise happen far too quickly and unevenly. Some households used a simple wooden lid with a hole cut through the center, allowing a small amount of airflow while still keeping the damp cloth firmly in place underneath. During the rationing years, when cold storage of any kind was a genuine daily struggle for many families without access to an expensive icebox, a damp cloth stretched over any container of food was standard practice in country kitchens up and down England, precisely because every extra degree of freshness mattered a great deal when food could not simply be replaced at a shop the very next morning. The eighth step is ongoing maintenance, and this is exactly where most people either quietly succeed for months on end or give up within the first week of trying. Check the sand every single day, and top it up with water whenever it feels dry to the touch more than a centimeter or two below the surface. Every few weeks, empty both pots fully, wash the sand clean, and let the pots themselves dry out in the sun for a full day before rebuilding the whole system. Because algae and mineral deposits will, over time, quietly clog the pores in the clay and slow the entire process right down. This is precisely the kind of small, repeated household chore that my grandfather never once complained about, because to him, it was no different at all to feeding the hens or drawing the morning's water. Simply part of what a well-run household did to look after itself without outside help. The ninth step is one that surprises almost everyone hearing it for the first time, and it concerns just how far this simple principle can be extended well beyond a modest pair of garden pots. Larger versions of the same idea were built using two ceramic urns or even wooden barrels lined carefully with clay, big enough to store a week's worth of milk churns or an entire family's vegetable harvest through the early weeks of autumn. Some farms in the north of England built cooling cupboards directly into the thick stone walls of a north-facing pantry. Using this same evaporative principle with a permanently damp slate shelf and a shallow tray of water set beneath it, keeping the whole room several degrees cooler than the rest of the house all summer long. Traveling traders in rural markets in the 19th century sometimes used wide, shallow dishes of water beneath wrapped muslin cloth to keep dairy produce sellable through a long market day, a smaller cousin of the very same principle at work in your two garden pots. But that is only part of what this method can do, and there is more still to come before we close. The 10th step concerns hygiene, and it is one that country households took every bit as seriously as the cooling itself, because the sand in the outer pots stay damp for weeks on end. They can, if left uncleaned, become a place where mold and bacteria take hold rather than a place where food stays safe. Wash your hands before handling anything stored inside. Keep raw and cooked foods well apart from one another, just as you would in any kitchen, and never use water that is not clean enough to drink yourself, since that same water will be seeping through the clay and sitting close to your food the entire time. My grandfather kept a separate bucket just for filling the cooling pots, marked with a strip of red cloth tied round the handle, so that nobody in the house ever mistook it for the bucket used to scrub the dairy floor. It is a small habit, but it is exactly the sort of small habit that made this method safe enough to feed a whole family for generations without a single case of illness ever traced back to it. Keep listening, because the 11th step shows you how to adapt this same principle when you do not happen to have two matching pots to hand. The 11th step is variation, because the countryside never depended on having the perfect materials, only on understanding the principle well enough to improvise around whatever was on hand. If you cannot find two pots of the right proportions, a single large unglazed pot wrapped on the outside with several thicknesses of damp hessian sacking or heavy cotton cloth will achieve a similar, if slightly less efficient, cooling effect. The cloth is kept wet in exactly the same way the sand is, and a shallow tray placed beneath the pot to catch any dripping water can be topped back onto the cloth each morning, creating a simple loop that needs only a few minutes of attention a day. This wrapped pot method was common among shepherds and farm laborers who carried a single earthenware jar of milk or water out to distant fields, keeping its contents noticeably cooler than the surrounding summer air for the better part of a working day. A similar trick was used for wine and cider casks kept in a farmhouse cellar, where a permanently damp sack draped over the cask made a measurable difference on the hottest days of late summer. Long before anyone had access to a proper cold cellar dug into the hillside, the 12th and final step, before we turn to the honest limits of the method, is scale, and understanding when this approach truly earns its keep in a modern household. A single pot in pot cooler suits a household, storing a modest amount of fresh produce day to day, the sort of quantity most families buy in a weekly shop rather than a monthly one. For a larger household or for anyone growing a substantial kitchen garden, 2 or 3 such coolers set up side by side in a shaded outbuilding can comfortably replace the bulk of what a small refrigerator would otherwise be asked to hold, leaving the electric fridge indoors free for the items that genuinely need it, such as raw meat or anything requiring near-freezing temperatures. This was, in fact, exactly how many English farmhouses managed their food storage well into the middle of the last century, using layered systems rather than a single solution for everything. Long before anyone assumed a single humming appliance in the corner of the kitchen was the only sensible answer available. The 13th and final step, before we close, is knowing the honest limits of this method, because plain honesty matters a good deal more than enthusiasm on its own. This is not a freezer, and it will never bring food down anywhere near freezing temperatures the way a modern electric appliance can manage without effort. It performs at its very best in warm, dry air, and rather less impressively in already cool or very humid conditions. Since the whole principle depends entirely on evaporation having somewhere useful to go, it requires daily attention. Quite unlike a fridge, you can simply shut the door on and forget about until you need it again. And it will not safely preserve raw meat for more than a day or so, which remains a job better suited to proper cold storage, or to older preservation methods, such as salting and smoking, that our ancestors relied on for exactly that purpose. Used sensibly, though, for vegetables, dairy, and the everyday staples of a working kitchen. It does a job that would otherwise cost a family a meaningful slice of their monthly electricity bill. And it does that job using materials that together cost rather less than a single takeaway meal from the end of the street. I think about all of this often, sitting here now, because what strikes me is not that the method itself is especially clever, since it is really quite simple once you understand what is happening inside that ring of wet sand. What strikes me is how easily a piece of knowledge like this can vanish from a household within a single generation, simply because nobody needed it any longer once the mains electricity arrived and the shop down the road never seemed to run out of anything worth buying. My grandfather never once saw it as old-fashioned or backward, only as sensible. And sensible knowledge does not go out of date the way a product on a shelf eventually does. He used to say that a household which understood how its own food was kept fresh would never truly go hungry, no matter what happened to the wider world around it, and I did not fully understand what he meant by that until I was a good deal older myself. There is something quietly steadying, I think, in knowing that your food can stay fresh without depending on a wire running back to a power station somewhere miles away, and without a bill landing on the mat each month reminding you of that dependence. It is not about rejecting everything modern, and I would never suggest that anyone throw out a perfectly good refrigerator on account of what I have shared with you today. It is simply about remembering that there was, and still is, another way sitting quietly alongside the modern one, ready to be picked back up by anyone willing to spend an afternoon filling 2 clay pots with sand. Anyone with 2 plant pots, a bag of sand, and access to an ordinary tap can reclaim this particular piece of self-sufficiency without spending very much money at all, and without relying on anyone else to keep it running properly. It will not replace a modern fridge for every single thing a household needs, and I would never claim otherwise, but for a good portion of what most kitchens actually store day to day. It does the job quietly, reliably, and for almost nothing. I have watched this exact pair of pots sitting in my own scullery for the better part of 40 years now, refilled each morning without a second thought, doing precisely what it was always meant to do. There is no patent on it, no subscription attached to it, and no engineer who needs calling out when something goes wrong. because very little ever does go wrong with a method this simple. That, to my mind, is worth a good deal more than people often give it credit for. If this is useful to you, there are more methods where this came from. I share a new one every day. The old ways are still here. You just have to know where to look.